music played such an indelible role in my life growing up. It was the soundtrack, to all these experiences. So I think music can change the world because it changes people. And if you take one person affected by music, and if they're effectively changed, you extrapolate that over 7.2 billion people, and it is one song at a time, slowly shifting and affecting culture. I think it's like the silent assassin.
This week, we're happy to welcome Ryan Tedder back to Art of the Song. It's our great pleasure and really an honor to talk with you today, Ryan Tedder. Welcome back to Art of the Song.
Absolutely. Music
came to you sort of in a private way, from what I understand, from harking back to our first interview. You definitely had music around you. You participated musically with your family, but how did you come to it on your own, finding your own voice?
It was rather difficult. I knew that I was obsessed with music on a different level than most people. And I quietly had sang in the privacy of my own bedroom closet for years and years and years, trying to hit every note that the popular songs of that time that were on the radio or the albums that I had, trying to sing like my heroes. One minute I'd be trying to sound like Peter Gabriel or Liam Gallagher. The next minute I'd be trying to sing like Boyz II Men or Prince, and just years of doing that. Not really, I was doing it just because I loved to do it. I didn't know, had no idea at the time that I was like quickly accumulating in excess of 10,000 hours of just musical absorption and practice and rehearsal. I didn't realize I wasn't doing it with intent, with any kind of end game. I just loved doing it. And once I started writing songs around the age of 15, and then really started writing at 17, 18, like proper arrangements. I was kind of studying arrangements in my spare time. Like what were the patterns in huge records of the time? The Diane Warren songs, the Whitney Houston songs, Mariah Carey, the Aerosmith and Beatles, you name it. I was kind of taking them apart and trying to figure out what made them tick. And then I discovered, this whole host of songwriters behind the scene that were making a living writing songs, and it was like discovering Santa Claus is real. And I realized, okay, that's what I want to do. So I had a very kind of humble goal. My goal was like, I remember telling my mom at some point, you know what? I'd love to be an artist, but I don't know that I want to be a solo artist. I'd love to start a band. I'm not sure what the sound would be, but my backup plan was getting a publishing deal, being a songwriter, and if I could score like $50,000 a year, I could live comfortably in Nashville, and all would be right in the world. And that was my goal. And as I kept kind of surpassing whatever goals I set, I kept obviously, as type A people do, you just keep making the goal more and more ridiculous. And then you quickly realize when you get old enough, you get to 30 and you go, oh, the goal isn't the point. The process is the point. Maybe I just love what I'm doing, to no end, and that's enough. And so that's kind of somewhere in the middle, some combination of like goal setting and just enjoying the process is where I live now. And I haven't looked back. I haven't had a real job since I was, I think, 21 or 22.
I love that you started out by saying that it was a little difficult at first, but you put in the hours on discovery.
Yeah.
One of my questions was that I wanted to sort of dig into how you have been able to write hit after hit after hit for such a diverse group of performers. Now, listening to how you did your study, it's making more sense to me.
When you're a kid and you're younger, success comes about. I've read a number of the Malcolm Gladwell books, which I love, and in his most recent one, he dissects, why are some people successful at a certain field in an extreme way, and why are others not?
Yes.
There are so many more factors that come to play than just talent. Talent is like 10 or 15% at most, I think, in any specific thing. Now, obviously, your physiology and biology is also important. Like, as much as I would want to be as good a basketball player as Black Mamba, as Kobe Bryant, I'm not 6'6", and I can't jump 3.5 feet in the air. So it doesn't matter how much talent I have, I'm never going to be as good as him. So the factor that kind of comes into play is the randomness of your environment the limitations of your environment, the upbringing. I was raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma. All right, in Tulsa, why specifically do I write, like, or have I been lucky enough to write quote unquote hits as opposed to just like really, whatever, indie underground records? And the reason is, in Tulsa in the 1980s and 90s, where I grew up, there were no cool radio stations. There was no, I grew up in a gospel music listening family, and the only thing that was allowed other than gospel music was like the Beatles, the Beach Boys, or whatever was on Top 40 radio. I couldn't listen to like crazy hip hop. We didn't really have a hip hop station. There were no edgy, I had no idea who Radiohead was, or Dinosaur Jr., Pavement, Pixies. None of that made its way to Oklahoma. So I was relegated to what was available. And since I love music, I consumed it like an addict, and I was consuming Top 40. So just take like an only child with insane amounts of boredom and unlimited time because I had no distractions, combine it with a musical father and having access to instruments, and then combine that with 10 to 15 years of making mixtapes off of Top 40 radio and singing every one of them and listening to them ad nauseum. And that was the alchemy. I mean, that was kind of the weird soup that the ingredients that led to where I'm at. I couldn't have controlled most of those things. If I had grown up in Boston and where near my family, I have a ton of family in New England. If I had grown up on the East Coast, I'd probably be doing something completely different. I don't think music would have happened for me. So It was environmental, it was luck, and it was me just being obsessed. And honestly, if I'd had a brother, I mean, there's all these things. Like, if I'd had a brother, I would have had a playmate. I would have exhausted countless days and weeks and hours hanging out with him, and I would not have been practicing piano. I would not have been writing songs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that kind of led up to it. But I think that's why specifically pop hits have found their way to me, is because of that, that environment growing up.
I love that you said that the pop hits have found their way to you. It sounds almost like you're collaborating with some other source.
Well, I'm a firm believer in God, and I believe in, where songs come from. I think songs that go on to help people, and not every song needs to be helping people. And like changing people's lives. It's not like I sat down and I'm trying to write a dance record for Selena Gomez or whatever, that I'm thinking, okay, how are we gonna address the situation in Aleppo? You know what I mean? I'm not
right. Sometimes it's just good fun. Yeah,
it's just good fun. I mean, the world needs to dance and let it go. And I've been doing a lot of, now that I've wrapped the One Republic album, I'm doing a lot of working with a lot of other dance outfits, the Chainsmokers and Kygo and so on and so forth, Alesso. So I love records like that, but in the context of One Republic, I try to do stuff that has a certain catharsis to it, that is like alleviating somehow, like whether it's just like the pressure of being a human and getting up every day, or heartbreak or loss or all these things. So that I try to deal with within the confines of my own band is where I get to delve into deeper issues, more kind of human, substantial issues. And then all the other stuff is just fun. It's like, I equated it earlier to, I get the same kind of neurotic high writing records, trying to write hit songs that the world want to hear. I get the same kind of high from that as I did playing Super Mario Brothers or, James Bond on Nintendo when I was in middle school and in high school. It's the same kind of rush. So it feels like an adult version of a video game to me. So yeah, as long as I have fun doing it, I don't see a reason to stop. And as long as as long as artists keep calling me to get in the room, I'll have a place to work.
Now, it seems that you spend an awful lot of time writing on the road, which is, from where I sit, a lot of when people go out on tour, they're not able to write out on the road. It seems that it's sort of two different hats. I was, doing the research, which I have to say, it's really fun to research an artist who's been had an extensive article in Billboard magazine and an extensive article in Forbes. That just feels really, really cool to me. You're wearing a lot of different hats. But it seems like it's very inclusive for you, so that when you're on tour, you can still write. You're talking about business end of things and branding, as well as creating these beautiful, heartfelt songs, as well as just some rocking, really good time songs just to dance to. How do you master that balance?
Sometimes poorly, sometimes well. Life is the pursuit of happiness and balance, right? Unfortunately, historically, there's very oftentimes a commensurate amount of imbalance with success. So you'll read stories on people who are wildly more successful than myself. It's incredible when you find the unicorn of a person that is perfectly balanced, or seemingly perfectly balanced and successful. Guys like maybe Richard Branson, where running an airline, running a hotel empire, running everything, and somehow hanging out and kite surfing and windsurfing 90% of the time. Like it defies logic. But then you have guys like Elon Musk, and I'm using the extreme examples, to make a point. A guy like Elon Musk who will admit, I have zero balance in my life whatsoever. I don't have room for, really a wife. I don't have time for leisurely activities. Going camping requires 2 private jets and a helicopter. There's people, but look what he's doing. He's literally inventing the future. I mean, he's a modern industrialist on par with guys like Edison, all the different, Rockefellers and all the different kind of titans of the 20th century. And I think that finding balance it's a day-by-day thing. Some days I nail it. I'm like, wow, I got so much done today. I hung out with the kids, went on a date with the wife, and I got to watch Netflix. This is like an all-star day. And then you have days or weeks where you're just like, I'm absolutely the worst dad. I've been gone for 7 days and haven't even been able to FaceTime the last 3 days. So it ebbs and flows. But for me, as far as on a business sense, how do I find balance? I find that the things that you're the most passionate about, that you're truly the most passionate about, they kind of force themselves on you, and they don't really let go. So songwriting for me is a muscle, and it's not one that likes to be inactive for that long. And if it's inactive, just like anything else, like your hamstrings, you go out and try to run a marathon, you're going to pull something. You're not going to finish the marathon. So writing on the road, I quickly realized the first hurdle, the most important hurdle that I've had to conquer in my career, was getting over that whole stigma and reluctancy to write on the road. Most artists do not like writing on the road. It's just counterintuitive to what they want to do. On our first album, we put out Apologize and then Stop and Stare. And that same year I'd done Bleeding Love, and then the next year I did a bunch of records for Beyonce and Kelly Clarkson, and some country records with Carrie Underwood and Rascal Flatts. And I took the first 6 or 9 months of our first tour, and I didn't write. I just played video games and vegged out and whatever. And then I got off the road, and all these people started hitting me up for records, and I didn't have any. And I was just like, I examined what the average artist does on the road. I don't care who you are, unless you're Springsteen and you're doing 3-4 hour shows. Your average artist has, from the time they wake up till they go on stage at 8:30 p.m. Let's say they're waking up around 10 or 11 a.m., which is typical when you're on tour. You go to bed late, you wake up late. That's like, what is that? I'm trying to do the math. That's 9-10 hours a day of usable time. For the life of me, I don't know what most artists do. They hang out in the hotel or watch Netflix again or work out. I mean, whatever. So I quickly was like, I could learn a new language. I could get a master's degree. There's so many things I could do with the amount of time disposable on the road. And I decided to hire an engineer, bring him on the road, set up a studio in every hotel room, get a mobile like Airstream studio that follows me on the road. And I decided to just keep the ball moving. And part of that is I'm a firm believer that an idle mind and idle hands never leads to anything good. And when you're a touring artist, you hear stories about drugs and alcohol abuse or affairs, infighting. So much of that has to do with excessive, insane amounts of time where guys are left to their own devices in foreign cities. Not too much good can come from that. So I poured it into songwriting, and to this day, that's what I do, and it keeps me sharp. That means when I go to do a One Republic record, I'm aware of where production is and trends in culture, sonically, musically, because you never really let your finger off the pulse. You just constantly stay sharp. And, not every song is a hit. There are guys that live in my neighborhood that have written a lot more hits than I have. But the fact that I still get to write and produce for other artists on the road and do One Republic, to me, is like, I feel like I've won the lottery. The other day I was in the UK. We went in to do a promo, a TV thing. So, I got an email from Ed Sheeran a few days before, and was like, where are you going to be this weekend? I was like, well, I'm going to be in the UK. He's like, so am I. Come up to Suffolk and let's write some songs. So I just made my flight a day earlier and banged out a bunch of song ideas, and that's kind of how I operate. I was... it depends on the artist, but it just kind of, the list goes on. If I have a spare time in a city and I got 5 hours, I had the guy from X Ambassadors come through the studio the other day. I was in writing for Selena Gomez, and then I walked into a different room and I sat with Sam from X Waters, and he played me a bunch of their music, and we started writing a song right there on the spot. So it flows from one moment to the next. I don't know how good of a balance that is, but that's just always the way I've done it.
There's so much to be done in this world. And if we all kept the kind of schedule that you did, I think we'd be in a better place. So thanks for the inspiration.
It's funny because I still have other stuff gnawing on me, because I still spend so much of my time is truncated specifically into music. There's this whole other side. I love languages. I desperately want to learn another language. I bought Rosetta Stone and started doing German in my spare time, and I want to get a master's degree. And, it's so funny. It's it can become insatiable, because there is a lot of time, and as important as social media is, spending hours a day looking for validation from perfect strangers is probably the worst possible use of time. Unless you're running your business via Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat. That's the one thing that I keep preaching, is just like, I love social media. I love it. I use it all the time. But that is also like a giant gaping hole. Like it's a time suck. So I'm really glad that it did not exist when I was a teenager, because again, that might have been the straw that like ended up distracting me from writing songs. So, all hail boredom. It can lead to some incredible places.
So far, you've mentioned Malcolm Gladwell, Richard Branson, and Elon Musk, all of whom have really changed the world and continue to do so. Do you think that music has a role in changing the world?
Oh, fundamentally. I had this conversation with a number of artists. The more old school artists, let's say the artists that were big in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that I've hung out with, they're sentimental. They're sadly sentimental about the lack of political, I don't even know what you'd say, political viscosity in music today. There's a lot of music saying a little. And I don't know what that means right now. I know that people want to escape. Music can change lives. Music can change the world. During tumultuous periods of time, wars, specifically wars, music historically has been a huge part of culture, and in reflecting people that were anti-war, and you have just as many songs that were actually written for soldiers that were like coming home. I forget the name of the song right now. One of the most famous songs in history was actually written for soldiers coming home for World War I, and I'm spacing on the name of it, but it's a song that like everybody knows. So music has played a huge role. If you've ever watched a film that's like moved you to tears and just impacted you to no end, I get to see a lot of movies. I screen movies because I do a lot of music for movies. We just did the theme song for Collateral Beauty, the Will Smith, Ed Norton, Helen Mirren, Keira Knightley. It's like the laundry list of actors that comes out Christmas Day. a song's called "Let's Hurt Tonight." It's track 1 off our new album. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever written. And so I get to watch the movie without music. I did another song for Sing, people that did Despicable Me, and I wrote this song that's coming out. Oh my God, what is today? All right, it's coming out in 2 days. Oh. So I wrote a song for Stevie Wonder and Ariana Grande, and it's a duet between them, and it's like, it's crazy. Stevie sounds like he's 25, Ariana sounds like $1 million, and it's the theme song to this movie. And these films, I get to watch them without music very often. I get to see just like scenes where it's just dialogue, and you would not believe how not impactful the most incredibly emotional scene is without music. You yank the music out of it, the tears don't happen, you don't get the goosebumps, you don't feel it. It's just two people having an argument, or two people, hugging it out or whatever. You add the John Williams strings or the Hans Zimmer, you add the Randy Newman song, and all of a sudden you're crying and you're covered in goosebumps. Music provides emotional viscosity, and in almost any environment or scenario. Sometimes I was walking down the street in San Francisco a month or two ago, listening to this really edgy kind of like funk record, and I literally felt my posture get straighter, and I was walking taller, and I all of a sudden had a strut, and I felt like I was in my own music video walking through the Mission in San Fran. And I remember thinking, this is so funny. It's like, I remember this happening to me when I was 13. This is one of the reasons I got into music, was I'd listen to it in different cities and different environments, and it created this like, larger than life feeling, and it made me feel invincible. And so I wanted to make music that made other people feel invincible and made them feel elated, or made them want to walk down the aisle or graduate or go cliff jumping. You know what I mean? Like I wanted to create these little soundtracks to human experiences, because music played such an indelible role in my life growing up. It was the soundtrack, to all these experiences. So I think music can change the world because it changes people. And if you take one person affected by music, and if they're effectively changed, you extrapolate that over 7.2 billion people, and it is one song at a time, slowly shifting and affecting culture. I think it's like the silent assassin.
Has parenthood shifted your creative process at all?
Parenthood has shifted my creative process in that I have to be, unfortunately, I could be accused of being selfish with my time, probably most of my life, because I am an only child. And making it in music or film or any kind of crazy endeavor requires a certain degree of selfishness for at least a period of time. And then you have to learn how to balance it and moderate it. Having kids has provided me way more inspiration. We had a song on our last album called I Lived that became kind of an anthem for a lot of people and raised a bunch of money for cystic fibrosis. And the truth is, I wrote all the lyrics for my son at the time, who was 2. I was having this like terribly, depressing thought of, I travel so much. I'm in so many airplanes. I'm in so many tiny airplanes, and I'm in, all these environments all the way around the world. And if anything should ever happen to me, I've never written anything for my kids. And so that's where I Lived came about. When Flight MH370 went down, I took that exact flight. I've taken that, MH370. I've taken that exact flight between those two cities on that airline. Yep. And I remember watching that. I was in a London hotel when that happened, watching that, just thinking, dear God, this is horrific. I was in a near cataclysmic event on a Russian airliner, landing in St. Petersburg about 5 years ago. And 2 weeks after that happened, the Prime Minister of Poland, flying into that same airport, his plane crashed and everybody died. Now, that didn't mean that I was any closer to happening to me, but you have enough of those little things happen, and you start to view your life through a different aperture, and kids adjust your aperture like nothing else. And so now my drive for being successful, maybe it's at any given point with an artist, a big part of it's self-validation. We're probably all running from some ridiculous insecurities. I know I'm sure I am. Somehow, if I sat down with a doctor and, he got all Freud on me, he would be like, "Oh my God, you're just wildly insecure and you're just doing all this to seek your own validation." But regardless, I think that now my pursuit of success in any level, as it pertains specifically to OneRepublic or my band, I want to write bigger songs that connect with more people so we can play bigger shows, so we can play less shows. That's literally where all this goes. My whole game plan for this band is to get it as big as we possibly can so I can do less. The larger venues you're playing, the less shows you have to do, the less time you have to be gone from your family. The less cost prohibitive it is to bring your family on the road. So there actually is some undercurrent of family economy that fuels my desire to write better songs, because it affords you more time. It's just the way it works in our industry. All that to say, I never really let off the gas, and the last 18 months is the least amount of songs I've written for other artists in the last 10 years, because I was doing nothing but OneRepublic. I did Adele, I did a little Ed Sheeran, and some dates with U2, and that was about it in 18 months, which for me was like basically musical anorexia. I was like, I just stopped writing for other people, and now that the album's done, I'm like insatiable. I've worked on 5 projects. I've got 5 or 6 songs coming out just from the last month of writing. And I'm just eager to get back into it. So as long as the family is kept in balance, and I don't feel like a complete deadbeat father, and I'm holding up my end of the bargain, then I'm going to keep plugging away.
Tell us a little bit about the new record. How do you feel about it?
I feel great about it. It's we'll never do an album this big again. We're probably going to release a smaller version of this album soon, because there's a ton of songs. It's funny. I was like, oh, there's so many songs. And then The Weeknd's album drops and there's 18 songs on it. I was like, oh, maybe there's not so many songs. But bottom line is, I personally think I'm not a glass half empty guy, and I'm not a cynic, but I'm a realist. I think the album as we know it is dying in its current form. 15 songs all from one source with a common thread is not how people are digesting music today. Specifically, I'd say under the age of 40 or 30. You get down below 30 and you're hard-pressed to find anybody that's consuming music that way. The world is going to playlists. It absolutely is what's happening. I already have it on good authority from a number of very famous artists who I won't name that they are done doing albums. Or this next album is their quote-unquote last, and they're switching to just doing singles and maybe EPs. And I feel like that's where it's headed. Our album is a playlist, though. So if you're going to go out on a good note, we made an album that is as ADD as your average human, overstimulated, social media addicted, Gen Y millennial fill in the blank. Mm-hmm. That's the album we made because it reflects me. I'm musically ADD, and I've been streaming since before that term was being thrown around. Like the first service that popped up around 07, 08 in the US, my wife and I signed on to it, and we've been streaming since 08. And it's just now really kicking in the US with Spotify and Apple. I think that's where it's headed, and I think that the album that we made is a signifier to me of that, because the album itself is genreless, and it hops lanes with no regard for the dots, and which could be if you're a traditional music critic. Fortunately we've gotten some pretty good reviews on this album, but some of the more traditional. It's funny, I can spot the age of a musical critic based on how they critique this album. If you rip it apart for being all over the place or too diverse, the odds are you're over a certain age.
How interesting.
If you think that it's just kind of step in time with what's happening, then I can guess you're probably a little bit younger. And obviously that's a very generalized statement, and it's not gospel, but that's the truth. Traditionalists, the long storied staff writers of Rolling Stone, and magazines such as that, they're the old guard, and they are cynics, and they get kind of gruff and inconsolable maybe about the idea of the album giving way, being subjugated by singles. But it is what it is, and I choose not to be cynical. I choose to embrace it and take what's new and run with it, because it's not going to change. For right now, it is like, what have you done for me this week? What's new that you've created today? What's new that's going to keep my interest longer than the next 5 minutes before I flip to the next thing? If you get cynical about it, that's kind of the beginning of the end. Anytime you're in a creative endeavor, the moment cynicism creeps in, you are kind of devolving yourself, from that creative field. And so I think it's exciting. I get to put out a bunch of new stuff all the time. This is the best album we've ever made, for sure. It is the most diverse. It is the largest. I'm not saying it's going to be the last, but how we're going to distribute albums and how we're going to release them and what an album even is, by the time we get to our 5th album, that will have completely changed, and I couldn't even begin to tell you. But I think we're just going to get down to just dropping new songs that we feel great about as we see fit, and I think that's what we do. You could call it the Drake model. You could call it, the Spotify model. Mm-hmm. You call it whatever. Yeah. But that's where I think it's headed.
Well, I think we, as human beings, naturally drift toward putting together a narrative that will fit our lives, and to have something that's diverse and flexible, like your new album, Oh My My. It's very much allows us to have that flexibility of narrative. Yeah, and also flexibility of styling. And everybody needs to put together their own playlist in a way that suits their lives. And I think that's one of the things that people have gotten away with, and why maybe albums are starting to slip. Well, they're they're almost obsolete. It's because people don't pay attention to what the through line is.
No, they don't, because and to be honest. And look, I'm of the age where I straddle like being a millennial and Gen Y, I think, is the generation. So I understand both sides of it. I'm maybe 2% sentimental about the loss of the idea that Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory, which was a seminal album for anybody growing up in the 90s like myself. Oasis, the idea that What's the Story, Morning Glory might not happen in 2018, like the idea that album would not be made, is very sad to me. Mm-hmm. But it is what it is. And I think that, look, we made an album, to be honest, we made an extensive album because our last album sold 5 million copies. In an era where people aren't really selling albums, we somehow managed to sell more than I ever thought possible.
That's nuts.
On one album.
Yeah.
So that the natural next step is make another album, right?
Right.
Little did we know that in the 2 or 3 years since our last album, the entire musical planet has shifted on its axis. Mm-hmm. And albums, unless you're Adele, who, by the way, sells to people over a certain age, mm-hmm. She sells millions and millions to people over a certain age who still buy albums. Unless you're really leaning towards a certain demographic of consumer that's older, not to put too fine a point on it, you're kind of spinning a hamster wheel to kill yourself to make some giant album. We had to do it because, our last album called for it. But I think moving forward, we're going to stay on our toes and be as malleable as we can be, because that's where the world's at. And, what are we doing if we're not connecting with culture and where the world's at? And, blah, blah, blah.
That's our job, right?
Yeah.
Ryan Tedder, thank you so much for joining us for Art of the Song. It's been such a joy to talk with you.
Likewise. Thank you.